In May 1969, American soldiers climbed a jungle-covered mountain in Vietnam 11 times. 11 times they were thrown back down. The hill had no name that mattered, just a number, 937 meters above sea level. But by the time those 10 days of hell were over, it had earned a different name, one that would echo through history and become synonymous with the futility of the Vietnam War itself. They called it Hamburger Hill, because that's what it did to men. It ground them up like meat. This is the story of one of the most controversial battles of the Vietnam War, a battle that killed 72 Americans and wounded 372 more. A battle that sparked protests in Congress and on college campuses across America. A battle for a hill that was abandoned just days after it was finally captured. This is the story of the Battle of Hamburger Hill and how 10 days of savage fighting changed the course of the war. Chapter 1. The Valley of Death. To understand Hamburger Hill, you first need to understand where it was and why American forces were there at all. The battle took place in the A Shau Valley, a remote stretch of jungle in South Vietnam's Thua Thanh province, right along the border with Laos. If Vietnam had a heart of darkness, the A Shau Valley was it. The valley was a critical part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the vast network of paths and roads that North Vietnam used to infiltrate troops and supplies into South Vietnam. It was a place where the jungle was so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground, where the mountains rose so steeply that helicopters struggled to land, where it rained so hard during monsoon season that entire hillsides would turn to rivers of mud. It was a place that belonged to the enemy, and everyone knew it. The North Vietnamese army had controlled the A Shau Valley since 1966, when they overran the U.S. Special Forces camp there. Since then, they had turned it into a fortress. They built storage facilities, hospitals, and truck parks deep in the jungle. They constructed elaborate bunker systems into the mountainsides with interconnected tunnels that could withstand artillery and bombs. They knew every trail, every ridge, every hiding spot. This was their ground. But in the spring of 1969, the U.S. military decided it was time to challenge that control. They launched Operation Apache Snow, a major offensive designed to disrupt enemy supply lines and deny the NVA their sanctuary. Multiple battalions from the 101st Airborne Division and the 1st ARVN Division would sweep through the valley, searching for and destroying enemy forces. It was supposed to be a routine search and destroy mission. It was anything but routine. Chapter 2. The men who fought the soldiers who would fight for Hamburger Hill came primarily from the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division. They were known as the Rakasans, a name that came from their service in Japan after World War II. In Japanese, it meant falling, down umbrella, a reference to their parachutes. By 1969, they were no longer jumping out of planes, but using helicopters instead. They were airmobile infantry, and they were good at what they did. Leading them was Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt, a 38-year-old career officer from North Carolina. Honeycutt was tough, aggressive, and old-school Army. His radio call sign was Blackjack 35, and his men simply called him Blackjack. Some would later call him the Butcher, though never to his face. Honeycutt believed in frontal assault, in overwhelming firepower, in taking the objective no matter what the cost. He was about to face the test of his career. The men under his command were a mix of draftees and volunteers, mostly in their late teens and early 20s. They came from small towns and big cities, from farms and factories. Some had been in Vietnam for months, hardened by combat. Others were fresh replacements, still learning how to move through the jungle without making noise, still figuring out which sounds meant danger and which were just the forest being a forest. They were tired, they were scared, and they were very far from home. Facing them on Hill 937 were soldiers of the 29th Regiment of the North Vietnamese Army. These were not Viet Cong guerrillas, but regular Army troops, well-trained and well-equipped. They had been in the A Shau Valley for weeks, maybe months, and they had used that time to dig in deep. They had constructed bunkers reinforced with logs and earth, positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire. They had cleared lanes through the jungle to improve their lines of sight while leaving the approach routes choked with vegetation. They had supplies, ammunition, and determination. They were ready. Chapter 3. The First Contact. May 10th, 1969, dawned hot and humid, just another day in the jungle. The soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, had been inserted by helicopter into landing zones around the A Shao Valley as part of Operation Apache Snow. Their mission was straightforward: conduct reconnaissance in force, find the enemy, and destroy them. What they didn't know was that they were about to stumble into one of the most heavily fortified positions in the entire valley. As Bravo Company moved through the dense jungle toward a ridgeline designated Hill 937 on their maps, they had no idea what awaited them. The vegetation was so thick that visibility was measured in feet, not yards. Every step was a struggle against vines, roots, and thorns. The heat was oppressive, and the weight of their gear, weapons, and ammunition made it feel like they were carrying another man on their backs. Then the shooting started. It came suddenly, violently, from positions that were invisible in the jungle. Machine gun fire ripped through the foliage. AK-47 rounds snapped past soldiers' heads. RPGs exploded in the trees. Men dropped, some killed instantly, others wounded and screaming. The attack was perfectly orchestrated, a classic L-shaped ambush that caught the Americans in a kill zone with nowhere to hide. Bravo Company tried to return fire, but they couldn't see the enemy. They were shooting at muzzle flashes, at sounds, at nothing. The North Vietnamese were firing from prepared positions, from bunkers that offered perfect protection and perfect fields of fire. The Americans were exposed, strung out along a jungle trail, unable to maneuver, unable to advance, barely able to survive. Lieutenant Colonel Honeycutt, monitoring the situation from his command post, quickly realized this was no ordinary contact. The volume of fire, the discipline of the enemy, the prepared positions, all told him one thing. There was a significant enemy force on that hill, and they weren't running. He made a decision that would define the next 10 days. He ordered his men to take the hill. Chapter 4: Assault and Repulse. The first assault on Hill 937 was launched on the afternoon of May 10th. Alpha Company joined Bravo Company, and together they attempted to fight their way up the hill. It was a nightmare from the start. The terrain itself was an enemy. The slopes of Hill 937 rose at angles that sometimes exceeded 70 degrees. In places it was less climbing and more pulling yourself up hand over hand, grabbing roots and vines, using your rifle as a crutch. The jungle was triple canopy, meaning 3 layers of vegetation blocked out the sun. At ground level, it was dim even at midday, and the undergrowth was a tangle of bushes, ferns, and wait-a-minute vines that snagged on everything. But the terrain was nothing compared to the fire. As the Americans climbed, the North Vietnamese opened up with everything they had. Machine guns swept the hillside. Snipers picked off soldiers who paused to catch their breath. Grenades rolled down the slope into the advancing troops. RPGs exploded against trees, sending shrapnel and splinters in all directions. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar of gunfire, and explosions that made communication almost impossible. Men fell by the dozens. Some were killed outright, cut down by machine gun fire as they struggled up the slope. Others were wounded, shot in the legs or arms or chest, and then faced the agonizing challenge of getting back down the hill. Medics moved through the chaos, trying to stop bleeding, trying to keep the wounded alive long enough to get them to a helicopter. The medevac helicopters, the Hueys with their distinctive red crosses, braved intense fire to land on small clearings and extract the casualties. By nightfall, the Americans had advanced perhaps 50 meters up the hill. They had paid for every meter with blood. The assault was called off, and the survivors dug in where they were, establishing a perimeter and preparing for a counterattack that, mercifully, never came. The first day was over. 9 men were dead, dozens wounded, and Hill 937 still belonged to the North Vietnamese. Chapter 5: Butcher's Bill. Mounts May 11th began with artillery. Hundreds of shells rained down on Hill 937, blasting the jungle, trying to destroy the bunkers, trying to kill the defenders. The explosions were so intense that they shook the ground, and the noise made it impossible to think. Trees were shattered, reduced to splinters. Fires started and were immediately doused by the morning rain. And when the bombardment finally stopped and the smoke began to clear, the defenders were still there. The second assault was launched at mid-morning. This time, Multiple companies attacked from different directions, hoping to overwhelm the defenders or at least divide their attention. It didn't work. The North Vietnamese had prepared for exactly this contingency. Their bunker system allowed them to shift defenders to whichever sector was under attack. Their fields of fire overlapped, creating kill zones that no amount of courage could cross. The pattern was the same as the day before. The Americans would advance crawling through the undergrowth, rushing from tree to tree, trying to close with the enemy positions. And the North Vietnamese would cut them down. Machine gun fire from mutually supporting bunkers created a web of death that was almost impossible to penetrate. Soldiers who got close enough to throw grenades at the bunkers found that the grenades just bounced off the log and earth construction, or rolled away before exploding. Lieutenant Colonel Honeycutt watched his casualty count rise and made a controversial decision. He called for more artillery, more airstrikes, and more assaults. Some of his officers questioned the wisdom of repeated frontal attacks against prepared positions. Some of his men began to question whether the hill was worth the price they were paying. But Honeycutt was convinced that the only way to win was to keep attacking, to maintain pressure, to give the enemy no rest. He believed that eventually the North Vietnamese would break. He was wrong. By the end of May 11th, the Americans had made minimal progress. Another dozen men were dead, and the wounded count was climbing toward 100. The hill remained unconquered, and morale was beginning to crack. Chapter 6. Into the Meat Grinder. The soldiers began calling it Hamburger Hill on May 12th. The name spread quickly, passed from foxhole to foxhole, spoken in tones of black humor and barely suppressed rage. Hamburger Hill, because that's what it was doing to them, grinding them up, turning young men into meat. The third day of battle was, if anything, worse than the first two. The weather turned and the monsoon rains began in earnest. Within hours, the hillside was transformed into a mudslide. Every step became a struggle. Soldiers would climb 10 feet and slide back 8. The mud caked their uniforms, their weapons, their skin. It got in their eyes, their ears, their mouths, and still they climbed. The rain also grounded the helicopters, which meant no resupply, no reinforcements, and most critically, no medevac flights. The wounded had to be carried down the hill on stretchers, an agonizing process that took hours and exposed both the wounded and their rescuers to enemy fire. Some men died waiting for evacuation, bleeding out in the mud while their friends tried desperately to save them. The air support was limited too. The low clouds and rain made it impossible for jets to see their targets. When they did drop their bombs, often using radar guidance, the results were mixed at best. The jungle absorbed the explosions, and the bunkers survived. A few times, bombs fell short, landing among the American positions and adding friendly fire casualties to the already horrific toll. But Honeycutt kept ordering attacks. Alpha Company, Bravo Company, Charlie Company, Delta Company, they all took their turn at the hill. They all paid the price. Some units lost half their strength. Platoons that went up the hill with 30 men came back with 15. The replacements who arrived to fill the gaps had no experience, no jungle craft, no time to learn. They died even faster than the veterans. By May 12th, something had changed in the soldiers. The initial shock and fear had been replaced by a kind of grim fatalism. They knew they were going to have to take that hill or die trying. Many assumed they would do both. They wrote letters home that they didn't expect anyone to read. They made pacts with their buddies about who would write to whose family. They stopped talking about the future. Chapter 7. The controversy erupts. While the battle raged on Hill 937, a different kind of battle was beginning back in the United States. The press had gotten word of the fighting, and the early reports were not good. Heavy casualties, repeated failed assaults, a hill in the middle of nowhere. Why were American boys dying for a hill that didn't even have a name? The questions reached the Pentagon, and from there to the White House. Military officials defended the operation, arguing that the North Vietnamese regiment on Hill 937 represented a significant threat that had to be eliminated. They pointed out that the 29th NVA Regiment was a veteran unit that had been responsible for numerous attacks on American and South Vietnamese forces. Destroying it was a legitimate military objective, but the critics weren't buying it. Senator Edward Kennedy took to the Senate floor and called the battle senseless and irresponsible. He questioned why, in 1969, with peace talks ongoing in Paris and public opinion turning decisively against the war, American commanders were still ordering the kind of frontal assaults that had been discredited in World War I. He demanded an explanation for why Hamburger Hill was worth the lives it was costing. The debate spilled over into the media. Newspapers ran stories questioning the military's tactics. Television news showed footage of muddy, exhausted soldiers being evacuated from the hill. The images were damning. These weren't the confident professional warriors of earlier war footage. These were scared young men, many of them barely out of high school, fighting and dying for reasons they didn't understand. Back on Hill 937, the soldiers knew nothing of the political firestorm. They were too busy trying to stay alive. Chapter 8. Reinforcements and Frustration. By May 13th, it was clear that the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry couldn't take the hill alone. They were exhausted, under strength, and demoralized. Honeycutt requested and received reinforcements. Elements of the 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry, and the 2nd Battalion, 501st Infantry, were redirected to Hill 937. South Vietnamese forces from the 1st ARVN Division were also brought in. The plan was to attack the hill from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. The plan sounded good in theory. In practice, it was a coordination nightmare. The new units had to be briefed, positioned, and integrated into the battle plan. The terrain made communication difficult, and the weather made it even worse. Radio batteries died quickly in the humid heat. The thick jungle blocked transmissions. Orders were misheard, positions confused. It was a recipe for disaster. May 14th saw the largest assault yet. Nearly 1,000 American and South Vietnamese soldiers attacked Hill 937 from 4 different directions. The result was chaos. Units became intermingled. Friendly fire incidents increased. The North Vietnamese, from their prepared positions, picked the attackers apart. The assault gained some ground, pushing the defenders back in places, but at terrible cost. The bodies piled up faster than they could be evacuated. One soldier later described it as like walking into a buzzsaw. No matter which direction you came from, no matter how you approached, the enemy had a bunker positioned to fire on you. They had thought it through, planned it, built it perfectly. Every approach was covered, every dead space was watched. There was no way to attack that hill without exposing yourself to fire from multiple positions. The night of May 14th was particularly bad. A North Vietnamese counterattack nearly overran one of the American positions. In hand-to-hand fighting, using knives and rifle butts and fists, the Americans held on, barely. When dawn broke on May 15th, the ground was littered with bodies, both American and North Vietnamese. The smell of death hung heavy in the humid air. Chapter 9. Breaking Point. May 15th, 16th, and 17th blurred together into a continuous nightmare of mud, blood, and explosions. The assaults continued, each one following the same brutal pattern: artillery preparation, airstrikes if the weather allowed. Then the infantry would climb the hill, fighting for every foot, and the North Vietnamese would stop them. Always, they stopped them. The physical toll was obvious. Men were wounded, killed, or evacuated. But the psychological toll was just as severe. Soldiers who had fought in other battles, who had survived firefights and ambushes, said they had never experienced anything like Hamburger Hill. The sheer intensity, day after day, with no relief, no rest, no respite, broke men in ways that bullets never could. Some soldiers began to crack. They would freeze under fire, unable to move forward or back. They would shake uncontrollably, their hands unable to hold their weapons. They would cry, openly and without shame, because crying was all they had left. The medics tried to help, but they were overwhelmed. And anyway, what do you do for a mind that's breaking? How do you heal a soul that's seen too much? There were whispers in the ranks, angry whispers about Honeycutt, about the chain of command, about the war itself. Some men talked about fragging, the practice of using a fragmentation grenade to kill an unpopular officer and making it look like enemy action. No one actually did it, but the fact that it was discussed showed how bad things had gotten. The unit was coming apart. On May 17th, a significant event occurred. A company commander refused an order to attack, telling Honeycutt that his men were too exhausted and too depleted to assault the hill again. It was an unprecedented act of insubordination, one that could have resulted in a court-martial. Honeycutt relented, giving that unit a brief rest while other companies continued the attack. The incident was quietly buried, but it showed that even the officers were beginning to question the cost. Chapter 10. The Final Push. By May 18th, something had to give. The battle had been going on for 9 days, and while the Americans had suffered heavy casualties, so had the North Vietnamese. Intelligence reports, based on prisoner interrogations and monitoring enemy radio traffic, suggested that the defenders were running low on ammunition and supplies. They had taken casualties too, and their commander had been requesting permission to withdraw. This was the time to strike. Honeycutt planned what he hoped would be the final assault. Every available unit would attack simultaneously from all sides. The artillery barrage would be the heaviest yet. B-52 bombers, flying from bases in Thailand, would carpet bomb the hilltop. Nothing would be left alive up there. And then, the infantry would take it. The night of May 18th to 19th, the B-52 strike went in. The bombs fell in a pattern, saturating the hilltop with high explosives. The ground shook for miles around. Trees were uprooted and thrown hundreds of feet. The noise was beyond description. A rolling thunder that seemed to go on forever. When it finally stopped and the smoke began to clear, it seemed impossible that anything could have survived. But this was Vietnam, and impossible things happened every day. The assault began at dawn on May 19th. 10 companies of American and South Vietnamese infantry, nearly 2,000 men, began climbing Hill 937 for what everyone hoped would be the last time. The defenders, battered but not broken, met them with fire. It was less intense than before, but still deadly. Machine guns still chattered, RPGs still exploded, men still died. The difference was that this time, there were too many attackers coming from too many directions. The North Vietnamese couldn't be everywhere at once. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to give ground. American soldiers reached bunkers and found them empty, abandoned in the night. Other bunkers fought to the last man, their defenders firing until they were killed or buried alive when satchel charges collapsed their positions. By mid-afternoon on May 19th, American forces had reached positions near the summit, but the fighting wasn't over. The North Vietnamese commander had kept a reserve force, his best troops, for a final stand on the hilltop. They fought with a ferocity born of desperation. Every meter was contested. Grenades flew back and forth. Men grappled with each other in the mud. It was primal, savage, utterly without mercy. As night fell on May 19th, the fighting died down. Both sides were exhausted, out of ammunition, out of strength. The Americans held most of the hill, but not the summit. Not yet. Chapter 11. Victory May 20th, 1969. The 11th day of the battle, the final day. At dawn, the artillery opened up again, but this time it was brief, just enough to keep the defenders' heads down. Then, from multiple directions, the American and South Vietnamese forces launched their final assault. This time, there was almost no resistance. During the night, most of the North Vietnamese had withdrawn, slipping away through the jungle using trails they knew by heart. They had fought as long as they could, inflicted as many casualties as possible, and then retreated to fight another day. The soldiers who climbed Hill 937 that morning found only a handful of defenders, diehards who fought to the death rather than surrender. By 5 p.m. on May 20th, Lieutenant Colonel Honeycutt stood on the summit of Hill 937 and declared it secure. The battle was over. The hill was theirs. The Americans had won. But at what cost? The summit of Hill 937 was a scene from hell. The jungle had been obliterated. Trees were reduced to splintered stumps. The earth was torn and cratered from artillery and bombs. Bodies lay everywhere, American and North Vietnamese, some intact, many not. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of blood, explosives, and rotting vegetation. Soldiers walked through it in a daze, unable to quite believe it was finally over. They found the bunker system that had caused them so much grief. It was extensive, well-designed, nearly impregnable. Some bunkers had 4 feet of earth and logs on top, enough to withstand anything short of a direct hit from a heavy bomb. They were interconnected by trenches and tunnels, allowing the defenders to move under cover. It had been a fortress, and it had nearly been an impregnable one. As night fell on May 20th, the survivors gathered on the hilltop. They were exhausted, filthy, traumatized. They had taken the hill, but they had left pieces of themselves on it. Many of them would never fully recover from what they had experienced over those 10 days. Chapter 12. The Butcher's Bill. The final accounting was brutal. In 10 days of fighting, the U.S. forces had suffered 72 men killed in action and 372 wounded. Some units had casualty rates exceeding 50%. The 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, which had borne the brunt of the fighting, was combat ineffective, requiring weeks to rebuild and refit. The North Vietnamese losses were harder to calculate. The Americans claimed 630 enemy killed, a number based on body counts and estimates. In reality, the number was probably lower. The NVA had a practice of carrying away their dead and wounded whenever possible, both to deny the Americans intelligence and to maintain morale among their own troops. But there was no question that they had suffered heavily too. The question that haunted everyone was simple. Was it worth it? In purely military terms, the answer was ambiguous. The 29th NVA Regiment had been mauled and driven from the A Shau Valley. Their bunker complex had been destroyed. The Ho Chi Minh Trail had been disrupted, at least temporarily. These were legitimate military achievements, but strategically, tactically, politically, the battle was a disaster. Chapter 13. Abandoned. On May 27, 1969, just 7 days after it was captured, Hill 937 was abandoned. The American forces withdrew, leaving behind only the dead they couldn't recover and the wreckage of the battlefield. No effort was made to hold the hill, to fortify it, to use it as a base for further operations. It was simply abandoned. The North Vietnamese returned within days. When word of the abandonment reached the United States, the reaction was explosive. If the hill wasn't worth holding, then why was it worth attacking in the first place? Why had 72 Americans died to take ground that was immediately given back to the enemy? The military's explanations, that the operation had been about destroying an enemy unit rather than taking terrain, rang hollow. This wasn't World War II, where every inch of ground mattered. This was Vietnam, where nothing seemed to matter. The controversy reached the highest levels of government. President Nixon, already looking for ways to reduce American involvement in the war, ordered changes to military tactics. No more major operations like Hamburger Hill. No more heavy casualties for minimal gain. The focus would shift to Vietnamization, training and equipping South Vietnamese forces to fight the war themselves while American troops gradually withdrew. For the military, Hamburger Hill became a lesson in what not to do. The Army studied the battle extensively, using it as a case study in everything from small unit tactics to the importance of public relations. The emphasis on frontal assaults against fortified positions was quietly abandoned. The next time American forces encountered a heavily defended hill, they would bypass it or bomb it into oblivion rather than assault it directly. But for the men who had fought there, these strategic considerations meant nothing. They had done what they were ordered to do. They had taken the hill, and then it had all been for nothing. Chapter 14. The Aftermath for the Soldiers. The survivors of Hamburger Hill went on to other battles, other hills, other days of fear and boredom and sudden violence. Some completed their tours and went home. Others extended, volunteering for additional time in Vietnam because they couldn't imagine going back to a world that didn't understand what they had experienced. Some were killed in later actions, adding their names to the growing list of American dead. Those who made it home found a country that didn't want to hear their stories. The anti-war movement was at its peak in 1969 and 1970. Veterans were sometimes spit on, called baby killers, treated as pariahs. The men who had fought on Hamburger Hill, who had shown incredible courage under unimaginable conditions, were met with hostility and indifference. They learned to keep quiet about their service, to avoid mentioning Vietnam in social situations, to bury their experiences deep inside. The psychological wounds were profound. PTSD, though not yet recognized as a formal diagnosis, was rampant among Hamburger Hill veterans. They suffered nightmares, flashbacks, survivor's guilt. Why had they lived when so many friends had died? What had it all been for? These questions had no good answers, and the lack of answers ate at them. Some turned to alcohol or drugs to numb the pain. Some isolated themselves, unable to relate to people who hadn't been there. Marriages failed, careers stalled, lives fell apart. The casualties of Hamburger Hill didn't stop at 72 killed and 372 wounded. Those numbers didn't account for the men who came home broken, the slow-motion casualties who died years later from the wounds that couldn't be seen. Lieutenant Colonel Weldon Honeycutt was promoted to full colonel and continued his military career. He defended his decisions for the rest of his life, insisting that the battle had been necessary and that his tactics had been sound. Some of the men who served under him agreed. Others never forgave him. When he died in 1999, there were veterans who mourned him as a hero and others who remembered him as the Butcher. The division never healed. Chapter 15: Legacy and Lessons. The Battle of Hamburger Hill became a watershed moment in the Vietnam War. It crystallized everything that was wrong with America's strategy in Vietnam, everything that made the war unwinnable. First, it demonstrated the limits of American firepower. The U.S. had thrown everything at Hill 937. Artillery, bombs, napalm, the most powerful military arsenal ever, assembled. And it hadn't been enough. The North Vietnamese had absorbed it all and kept fighting. No amount of bombs could win this war. Second, it showed the futility of measuring success by body count. Even if the American claims of 630 enemy killed were accurate, so what? The North Vietnamese simply replaced their losses and came back. There was no finish line, no clear victory condition. You could kill 1,000 enemy soldiers and there would always be more. Third, it revealed the disconnect between military objectives and political reality. The military saw Hamburger Hill as a successful operation that had destroyed an enemy regiment. The American public saw it as a pointless slaughter. And, in a democracy fighting a limited war, public opinion matters more than military success. You can win every battle and still lose the war. The battle also highlighted the incredible courage and resilience of the American soldier. The men who fought on Hamburger Hill didn't quit, didn't surrender, didn't break, despite conditions that would have destroyed lesser men. They did their duty, even when that duty seemed senseless, even when they knew the hill would probably be abandoned. That kind of courage deserves to be remembered and honored. In 1987, a film called Hamburger Hill brought renewed attention to the battle. The movie was raw, unflinching, showing the violence and horror without glamorizing it. It was not a commercial success, but it was important. It gave the veterans a voice, a way to tell their story to a new generation. It reminded people that the soldiers who fought in Vietnam deserved respect, regardless of how one felt about the war itself. Chapter 16: The Broader Context. To truly understand Hamburger Hill, you have to understand what was happening in America in May 1969. The Vietnam War had been going on for years with no end in sight. Every week, the casualty reports came in, and every week more young men came home in body bags. The draft was tearing communities apart, dividing families, sparking protests on college campuses across the nation. The Tet Offensive of 1968 had been a military victory for the United States, but a psychological and political defeat. When Americans watched the news and saw the U.S. Embassy in Saigon under attack, when they heard General Westmoreland requesting 200,000 more troops, they began to question everything they had been told about winning the war. The credibility gap between what the government said and what people could see with their own eyes was becoming unbridgeable. President Lyndon Johnson had declined to run for re-election in 1968, effectively driven from office by the war. His successor, Richard Nixon, had campaigned on a promise of peace with honor, a plan to end the war without admitting defeat. But Nixon's plan, Vietnamization, would take time. In the meantime, American soldiers were still fighting and dying. So, when news of Hamburger Hill hit the papers and television screens, it landed in a country already deeply skeptical about the war. It became a symbol, a rallying point for anti-war activists. If this was what it took to win, if this was the cost of victory, then maybe victory wasn't worth it. The military's response to the controversy was telling. They argued that Hamburger Hill was actually a successful example of attrition warfare. The North Vietnamese had suffered heavier casualties than the Americans, and in a war of attrition, that's what mattered. But attrition warfare requires that the enemy run out of men before you do. And North Vietnam, with a population of 16 million and a virtually unlimited willingness to sacrifice, was never going to run out of men before the United States ran out of political will. Chapter 17. What if? It's tempting to play what if with Hamburger Hill. What if Honeycutt had bypassed the hill instead of assaulting it? What if he had used different tactics, perhaps a longer siege, or more extensive use of chemical defoliants to strip away the jungle cover? What if the operation had been called off after the first few days, when it became clear that the enemy was too strongly entrenched? The truth is, none of these alternatives would have fundamentally changed anything. If not Hamburger Hill, it would have been some other hill, some other battle where American soldiers died for objectives that couldn't be held, and victories that meant nothing. The problem wasn't the tactics at Hamburger Hill. The problem was the entire strategy of the war. The United States was trying to defend South Vietnam from North Vietnam, but the South Vietnamese government was corrupt and unpopular. The U.S. was trying to win hearts and minds, but the methods used to do that, the forced relocations, the free fire zones, the use of chemical weapons, alienated the very people they were trying to help. The U.S. was fighting a limited war with limited objectives, but the enemy was fighting a total war with no compromise. That asymmetry made victory nearly impossible. Hamburger Hill was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was a flawed strategy based on faulty assumptions about the nature of the war and the determination of the enemy. No amount of courage, no level of sacrifice by American soldiers could overcome those fundamental strategic flaws. Chapter 18. Remembering the Fallen. On the wall of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., there are 72 names associated with the Battle of Hamburger Hill. These men came from every corner of America, from cities and farms, from rich families and poor, from every race and background. What they had in common was that they answered when their country called, and they paid the ultimate price. Each of those names represents a life cut short, a future that never happened. Each one was someone's son, maybe someone's brother or husband or father. Each one had dreams and plans and people who loved them. And each one died on a jungle, hill in a foreign land, fighting for objectives they probably didn't understand. In a war their country was losing. Their sacrifice deserves to be remembered, not because the war was right or the cause just, but because they were brave and they did their duty. They fought not for grand abstractions like freedom or democracy, but for each other, for the men beside them. That's what soldiers do in combat. They fight for their brothers. Everything else is politics. The men who survived Hamburger Hill carry those 72 names with them. They remember the faces, the voices, the last words. They remember who died first and who died last. They remember the moments of terror and the longer hours of grinding misery. They remember because someone has to. Every year, some of them gather for reunions, getting together to share memories and pay tribute to the fallen. The numbers dwindle each year as age and illness take their toll. But as long as any of them survive, the memory of Hamburger Hill survives too. Chapter 19. The North Vietnamese Perspective. It's important to note that there's another side to this story, one that's often forgotten in American accounts. The North Vietnamese soldiers who defended Hill 937 were also fighting for what they believed was right. They saw themselves as patriots defending their homeland against foreign invaders. They had courage too, and they suffered and died just like the Americans did. The soldiers of the 29th NVA Regiment knew they were going to face overwhelming firepower. They knew the Americans would bring everything they had: artillery, bombs, napalm. They knew most of them would probably die, and they stayed anyway. They dug their bunkers deeper, checked their ammunition, wrote letters home, and prepared to fight. That takes a special kind of courage, too. When the battle was over and they had withdrawn, they counted their own losses and mourned their own dead. They held no services in the jungle, marking the graves with bamboo crosses before moving on to the next battle. Many of those graves were lost, the markers rotted away, the locations forgotten. Those soldiers are as lost to history as if they had never existed. In Vietnam today, the battle is remembered differently than in America. It's called the Battle of Dong Ap Bia, and it's commemorated as a victory. A successful defense that inflicted heavy casualties on the Americans and forced them to abandon their objective. The fact that the North Vietnamese also withdrew is downplayed. In war, everyone claims victory, The truth is probably somewhere in between. Both sides fought bravely. Both sides suffered. Both sides claimed victory. And in the end, it didn't matter. The war would drag on for 6 more years, claiming hundreds of thousands more lives before finally ending with the fall of Saigon in 1975. Chapter 20. Conclusion. The Battle of Hamburger Hill lasted 10 days in May 1969, but its impact resonates to this day. It stands as a stark reminder of the cost of war, the futility of fighting without a clear objective, and the courage of the men who fight regardless. The hill itself, Hill 937 in the Aishau Valley, is still there. The jungle has reclaimed it, covering over the scars of battle. The bunkers have collapsed, the trenches have filled in, the bodies have long since been recovered or turned to dust. Nature has healed what man destroyed, but the memory remains. For the veterans of Hamburger Hill, the battle never really ended. They carry it with them, every day, in the nightmares that wake them at 3 a.m., in the sounds that make them flinch, in the memories they can't escape. They survived the battle, but in some ways, they're still fighting it. For the families of those who died, there's a different kind of pain. The what-ifs, the might-have-beens, the hole in the family that can never be filled. They received a folded flag and a telegram expressing regret. It wasn't enough then, and it isn't enough now. Nothing could ever be enough. For America as a nation, Hamburger Hill was a turning point. It accelerated the process of disillusionment with the war, contributing to the policy changes that eventually led to American withdrawal from Vietnam. In that sense, the 72 men who died there didn't die in vain. Their sacrifice and the controversy it sparked helped bring the war to an end. But that's cold comfort for the men who were there. They didn't want to be part of a turning point or a cautionary tale. They wanted to do their jobs, survive their tours, and come home. Some did, many didn't. And those who made it back were never quite whole again. The story of Hamburger Hill is ultimately a story about the cost of war, paid by the people who fight it. It's about courage and sacrifice, yes, but also about the terrible things that nations ask of their young men. It's about the gap between military objectives and human cost, between strategy and suffering, between what politicians decide and what soldiers endure. It's a story that should never be forgotten, because if we forget what happened on that hill in May 1969, if we forget the price that was paid and the lessons that should have been learned, then we risk repeating those same mistakes. And somewhere, someday, other young men will find themselves climbing another hill, fighting for objectives they don't understand, paying a price that's too high for any victory worth having. That's the legacy of Hamburger Hill. Remember it, honor it, learn from it, and pray that no future generation has to live through it again. Epilogue. Never again, except when it happens again. The promise after Vietnam was never again. Never again would America fight a war without clear objectives. Never again would we commit troops without the full support of the American people. Never again would we fight with one hand tied behind our back. Never again would we measure success by body counts and ignore strategic reality. Never again. And yet, here we are. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan lasted even longer than Vietnam. The objectives were unclear, the strategies flawed, the mission constantly redefined. Young Americans fought and died on dusty hills in Afghanistan that were just as remote and just as pointless as Hamburger Hill. The lessons were forgotten, the mistakes repeated. Maybe that's the real lesson of Hamburger Hill. Not that war is hell, everyone knows that. Not that courage matters, of course it does. But that we forget. We forget the cost, we forget the pain, we forget the promises we made, and then we do it all over again. The men of Hamburger Hill deserve better. They deserve to be remembered not just as statistics or symbols, but as individual human beings who faced an impossible situation with courage and determination. They deserve a nation that learns from their sacrifice, that remembers what they went through, that thinks long and hard before asking another generation to climb another hill. That's what this story is really about. Not tactics or strategy or politics, but people. Real people who lived and died in ways that should never be forgotten. Remember Hamburger Hill. Remember what it cost. Remember why it mattered. And remember that the price of forgetting is always paid by someone else. Someone young, someone who trusts that their nation wouldn't ask them to die for nothing. Don't let Hamburger Hill be forgotten. The men who fought there, who died there, who survived there but left pieces of themselves behind, they deserve at least that much. Remember,